For a quick reference to the index for this video, please see the description below. I've got 4 of these rod building jigs that are ready to be shipped out. I'm going to list them on eBay for sale. I wanted to do these through YouTube, but really with shipping, I can get a discount. It just works out to be a wash basically between selling them myself and selling them through eBay. So I've decided to list them on eBay. I'm going to have them on with a link in the description. So if you're interested in purchasing one of these, you can check the link in the description to go to the eBay listing for these rod building jigs. There's a few examples here of some of the wraps that I've done using nothing other than this rod building jig. I even used the jig to apply the epoxy on these wraps, just rotating it every so often. And I'm going to do some videos that will describe exactly how you can do these sorts of things. For now, what I've done is created an instructional video that I think will be helpful to anyone interested in purchasing one of these. I just wanted to talk real quick about some of the features and what I feel are benefits to using this rod wrapping jig. First of all, the materials that I used are pretty good stuff. The jig itself, the supports and the thread carriage is made out of high density polyethylene, and the reason why I feel like this is a superior material to others like wood or steel is it's chemical resistant. I can put acetone on these and it won't do a thing to it. In fact, the acetone bottles that you buy as nail polish remover, they're made out of high density polyethylene. The high density polyethylene rod supports will also allow you to get away without using felt. A lot of the wood wrapping jigs use felt as a liner, and the reason for that is because the fibers in the wood can actually act like sandpaper and wear on the finish as you're rotating the rod. By using high density polyethylene, you don't have to worry about this material actually scratching your rod. It's slightly softer than your fingernail. You can scratch it with your fingernail. So it's not going to damage your rod finish as you're working on your wraps. It is weather resistant. It's not going to matter if it gets wet. This allows you to be able to store these in a non-climate controlled environment. Just the reality is that most people who are looking at a manual wrapping jig instead of a powered one, it's probably a hobbyist, somebody that's not trying to do production work. Or they just enjoy taking their time and producing the best quality they can get. So if this is kind of geared towards people who do this as a hobby, I want people to be able to store them in their garage if they want to and not worry about them warping or rusting. The only possible problem you might run across is on the rod itself. It is galvanized, but the ends of it where it was cut have been polished. I didn't want anybody cutting themselves on the cut ends of these rods. So they're polished. So a little bit of that material, the galvanizing material, is gone at the end. A real light coat of oil would take care of that as far as rusting goes. I really don't think it's going to be an issue, but I just want you to be aware that these ends where they're cut, they could rust a little bit there. But the pipe itself is actually galvanized. This one's mine. It's got some scratches on it. The ones that I'm selling will not have those scratches and things. This one's one I kept for myself, so it doesn't matter to me. But yours will not have these scratches in it when you get it. And the pipe itself is actually made out of 1/2-inch conduit. So it's rigid in a short piece like this. It's not going to bend or anything. So it's plenty rigid for this application, and it's easy to find it anywhere just about that anyone would live. You can find this stuff at home improvement stores, at hardware stores. It's just 1/2-inch conduit. The reason I wanted to make it out of a material that people could find locally is if you wanted a longer one, you wouldn't have any problems to go get a custom one cut for you. The only problem you might run into is a lot of times when they cut these in the stores, it kind of bulges the ends out. If that happens, you can just use a tubing cutter and cut the end off maybe an inch or so away from where they cut it. You can actually cut that tubing with one of these tubing cutters. These are just inexpensive tubing cutters, and you put the pipe in it and you tighten it down and rotate it, and this over time will cut through. It's a carbide cutting wheel, and that will over time cut through the pipe. Then you'll just want to clean up the ends with a file or something like that. If you decide to make another rod, like I said, this one's going to work for most anything that the normal person would use it for. These come in long sections. You can get them up to, I know our stores have them at 10-foot lengths. It's pretty common. You can cut them down in the store to get them home, and then you can make them whatever length you want. You could make multiple lengths. What I'm sending with these jigs is a 16-inch rod, and that will work fine for 99% of what anybody's doing. If you have an unusual case where you need a longer rod or even a shorter one for whatever reason, you can actually have one cut and it won't be a big deal. You can do that locally. These are all pretty common. They're about 18 millimeters approximately in diameter, so the hole sizes on the supports will fit. And I actually make these supports to where they'll slide real easy in and out, so it's easy to adjust it. And there's even just a little bit of play, so you've got a little wiggle room just in case your rod is slightly different or slightly ovaled. You'll have a little room to play with here, and it shouldn't be any issue for you getting another rod cut if you want to change your length of the rod. But for most applications, this is going to work just fine. That's plenty wide for most of what anybody would want to do. And you can move them as close or as far away from the thread carriage as you want to. You can turn them around to face different directions. If you're wrapping a tip top, you can just slide those around. Put the thread carriage here at the end, and you can wrap your tip top right there at the end of the jig. The thread carriage itself is made to slide real easy, and it's actually got more play on it than the supports. And that's actually intentional. I wanted it to be able to move from real quick and easy if you need to change the angle that your thread is coming through this front guide. You can simply just rock this back and forth just a little bit. And if you need to move it more, you can slide it on the rail, of course. You can slide it a further distance. But if you just need to change the angle slightly, you can change the angle just by rocking it back and forth. And the thread carriage also, if you look at it, it looks like it's designed to where this whole part sets flat on the table, and it's not. Actually, the only part that should touch the table is back here at the end. And again, the reason for that is there's less friction when you're sliding it back and forth if it's just on this one area than if it's covering this whole surface moving back and forth. I wanted this to be easy to slide back and forth on the rail so you can do it quickly as you're working. And when you are sliding this on the table, because of the high density polyethylene, you don't really have to worry about it scratching up a table. If you're like me, I occasionally work at my dining room table. Well, I don't want to scratch it up, so this material is actually just a little softer than your fingernail. You can scratch it with your fingernail, but it's very rigid. It's very solid, and you don't have to worry about the weather conditions with it or anything like that. If you have a wooden jig and it's sliding on rails and things like that, you could run into some problems with it when the humidity levels are high, or if it's dry, the air's dry. It can swell, expand, contract, and it's not rot resistant. This stuff is rot resistant. This HDPE is, so you don't have to worry about that either. The friction plate and the friction washer that you can see the orange one back there. These could be different colors on different units. The first ones I'm selling are orange, The next ones might be blue, they might be red, they could be purple, they could be clear, they could be white. These are also made out of HDPE, high density polyethylene, because it has a good self-lubricating type properties to it. So that allows these to turn freely, but there's enough friction still that if you tighten it down more, you can really put a lot of tension on these spools if you need to. Most people don't need that much tension. It's there if you need it. If you don't, you get good adjustment with the springs. It allows a lot more control over the spool movement. And these move very freely, very easily. There's no binding or anything. It's just a really nice setup. The spring tensioner rod is nice because it can allow you to back up to correct a mistake. I'll be showing you that on this video, how you can correct a mistake. If you're wrapping and your wraps get loose, you can go back, and because of this tensioner rod that's pulled down this way, as you back up, it's going to keep tension on the thread. So ordinarily, you'd have to back the spool up along with the rod. Now, if you're wrapping metallic threads, as I'll show you, you'll still have to back the spool up, because I prefer, if you do it the way I do it anyway, I prefer to wrap the metallic thread straight onto the rod off the spool. That's because I don't want that foil wrapped thread running through these different guides, giving it a chance to possibly mess that foil up. I want to wrap it straight off the spool onto the rod. But when you're using normal thread, you've got this tensioning rod that will actually allow you to back up to correct a mistake. So that's a really nice feature too. The thread carriage itself is very adjustable. You can use it a lot of different ways. You can use different lengths of spools. You can use long spools. You can use short spools. As long as the spool is under, I would say, about 2¼ inches, it's going to fit on this, which is really nice because most of your rod wrapping threads are short spools. They're around 1 inch or so tall. But if you're like me, I use a lot of thread that's not necessarily made for wrapping rods, and they come on bigger spools such as these. This gives me the ability to use those longer spools also. But it can be configured a lot of different ways, and I'll be showing you that later on in the video. You can configure it several different ways for whatever types of spools you're using, and you can even use different length spools at the same time, and I'll get more into that in a little while. For right now, I'm going to start a wrap on this rod, and I'm going to show you one other nice feature is you can actually let go of this whole contraption as you're wrapping, walk away from it and come back to it, and everything's going to stay where you put it. Okay, on most wrapping jigs, once you start a wrap, you can't really let go of the rod. The way I've made this one is I've used these Holdowns on the supports, and that will allow you to actually let go completely, and everything's still under tension here. I can completely let go of that rod, walk away from it, go get me a pair of scissors or a razor blade or whatever, a soda, answer the phone, whatever you need to do. You can walk away from this without it coming unraveled. It's going to stay there until you get ready to come back. When you do come back, you can pick up right where you left off, and this rod is going to still be in the same position. It's not going to have rotated or anything like that. Now, if you're using very light tension on your spool, that spool might start to slowly creep, and all that will do is just raise that tension rod, but you're still going to have tension here at the wrap. So no matter what, you can walk away from this and come back to it a few minutes later and pick up right where you left off. So just say on this one I'd started my wrap and realized I didn't have anything to cut my tag in with. I could walk away from it, go get something, cut my tag in, and pick up right where I left off. It won't hurt a thing. That's a really nice feature that a lot of wrapping jigs just don't have. This one, it makes it simple to start, stop. With the control rod, if you're using normal thread, you can back up a few turns to correct a mistake. I'm going to cover more about the rod wrapping jig in the video here in a few minutes. I just kind of wanted to show a lot of the features and what I think makes this wrapping jig superior to a lot of them that I've seen. And I really think you're going to enjoy it. I think it's a good quality unit. I think the price is fair for what it is. Unfortunately, the materials are not inexpensive to make these, but you're getting a good quality product that should outlast something that's made out of wood or a lot of other materials. It's chemical resistant, it's weather resistant, it's rot resistant. I really think it's just a really nice setup for the do-it-yourself rod builder. And you could even do high quality work with this. It's just there's no power wrapping feature to it, but you're not paying a power wrapper price either. I had this gigantic surf rod that, as you can see, that is one huge guide. Well, it didn't work with the original prototype because the guide would hit the thread carriage as it was coming around. So even though I know a lot of people that do surf rods have power wrapping jigs, I wanted to make this hand wrapping jig to where if you have a huge guide on a rod, you can still do it, especially if you're just repairing a rod. You know, guides break, you might want to repair a huge guide like this. I wanted to give people the ability to do that. It probably wasn't necessary for most folks, but I just wanted to make it possible. If you did want to do that, you could do it with this jig. When you receive the wrapping jig in the mail, it will come in a few pieces. There's 3 supports, a metal rod, and then there's the thread carriage assembly. The thread carriage assembly requires some assembly, and all you need for this is a number 2 Phillips screwdriver. You'll see here on the thread holder, it has a rounded corner on the front, and that rounded corner will go towards the front of the carriage assembly. There's a screw hole on the top, and there's 2 screw holes on the bottom of the thread holder, and there's 2 corresponding holes on the bottom of the thread carriage. Those holes are countersunk on the bottom so that the screws will fit flush with the bottom of the carriage. So in order to get all this lined up, if you'll just go ahead and put the screws in and then turn your thread holder with the rounded nose towards the front of the carriage, and then turn the whole thing upside down, you can insert the screws. It's best to start the screws backwards and let them drop into place, because this is threaded plastic, and the threads, you can cross thread plastic pretty easily. But if you start your screwdriver backwards, it will drop the threads into place, and then you can start moving it forward clockwise to tighten down the screws. And if you'll tighten one part of the way down, snug it up, and then tighten the other one down, that'll give you a little wiggle room if you're having trouble getting it to line up. At this point in the process, what I like to do is go ahead and start assembling the whole jig. There's one more part that has to be screwed on, but we'll get to that after we get the jig put together. It's just easier to do it with the jig in place. So we're going to start with the metal rod, and this support stand has no hole in it. That's the standalone support, and the other 2 support stands have holes through them. That's where the metal rod goes that keeps everything in alignment. As you can see, there's a band on the back side of the jig stand, and that band will face the rear side of the jig as you're putting it together. That's just the hold down band for the rods that goes over the top of the rod to keep it in place. Again, that stand has no hole in it. That's the standalone support. And this one has a hole in it. Again, the band is facing the back side of the stand as we're putting it together. So that's really all there is to putting the stand together. The last thing left to do is to install the tensioning rod. The tensioning rod has two loops, one on each end, and one loop is actually a little larger than the other. The smaller diameter loop is where the screw will go in. You'll just go ahead and take that screw and put it in the smaller diameter loop and put it in the screw hole. Again, I'd recommend backing the screw up to get it started. I didn't in this video, but it dropped into place. I felt it when I put it in there. That just helps keep you from cross threading it if you'll start it backwards first and then turn it clockwise to tighten it. So this jig is fully adjustable. You can adjust the thread carriage. The rod supports are adjustable on the metal rod that ties the whole jig together. So here's just a normal layout of the rod building jig. You'd have your grip on the left hand side on the standalone support, using these bands to hold the rod down. Now I'm going to show you how you can reconfigure the jig if you're doing wraps on a tip top, because that can be a little difficult to do if you don't have good support. The tip top tends to want to bend. It can be kind of a difficult area to work on, but if you'll just take the right hand side support off and turn it around to the other end, then you can wrap tip tops also just by sliding the thread carriage all the way to the end of the jig. And then just to put it back in its normal configuration, just do the reverse. Move the extra support back to the other side. Let's talk a little bit about the thread carriage. The thread carriage is very versatile. I spent a lot of time thinking about how I wanted to set these up. I use high density polyethylene to build the rod jig itself. I also use high density polyethylene on the orange pieces that you can see on this jig. And by the way, the tension discs that I'm using here, like that orange plate, it's intentionally drilled a little large on the hole size, and I'll get to that in a little bit as to why that's that way. But the way that these plastic pieces work is almost like drag washers on a fishing reel's drag system. It allows some slippage, but it can also be tightened down. It's not totally friction free, but it's low friction. Here's a problem with a lot of wrapping jigs. They just use a regular wing nut and a spring. And you know what happens here in that situation is once you have it tightened down and start pulling thread off one way or the other, it can either tighten or loosen your wing nuts. As you can see here, that wing nut's backing off when the thread's pulled that direction. What'll eventually happen is you'll lose your tension, and you don't want that while you're in the middle of a wrap. So that was one of the considerations I had when I was designing this thread wrapping setup here. I wanted to make it to where the wing nuts couldn't move. So by using this bar that's also a friction plate, it serves two purposes. It isolates the motion of the spool from the wing nuts, and it also acts as a friction plate. So it gives you low friction, but not no friction, so that you can actually tighten these down more or less. And the springs actually provide a more controlled way of applying the tension. All I'm doing here is just showing you how the thread carriage comes apart completely down to the basics. There's a couple of washers on each side that are made out of high density polyethylene. And I make those out of recycled products. It's just kind of something I do. I don't like to be wasteful. I like to reuse things when possible. So I kind of carried that over into these jigs. That's the only part that's recycled on the jigs, but I have easy access to free high density polyethylene in everyday products that I buy. So why not reuse it? It gives me, it's just something I like to do. I think it's a good thing to do for the environment. So I'm reusing the materials. So this one's orange. The next one might be blue. The next one might be purple. They could be any color, but they could even be translucent or white. But I just felt like it was important to do that. As you can see, these threaded rods are 3 inches long. That will give you an idea of how big of a spool that you can get on these. As you can see here, I have 4 different size spools, and they vary quite a bit. And you can actually use spools of very different sizes together the way I designed this. It actually works out okay. So on these washers, on a normal configuration, you'd put on one of the friction washers first. I'm just going to go ahead and do both sides here. So now the friction washers are in place. When you look at the metal washers, these are stamped washers, so one side will be smoother than the other. You always want to turn the smooth side toward your wear areas. As you can see, that's got a little rough edge, and that side's smooth, so I want to put that side towards my friction washer. And after you put the large washers on, the next step is to go ahead and install the spool. This spool is a little over 2 inches long. It's a tight fit on this setup. Using the spring, you can actually use it without the spring if you have to. But if you can use the spring, you're better off. It'll give you more control over your spool. And going down in size, the smallest one is just over 1 inch. But there's different ways that you can set this jig up to where you can use different length of spools from top to bottom, and you can work around it somewhat. It's really a versatile setup. Here you can see I'm going to go ahead and install one size on the top, and I'm going to put one that's just a little longer on the bottom. And the one that's going on the bottom is actually the longest spool that I own. I'm sure they make longer ones. If they do, they probably won't fit on this jig unless it's really close in size to that one on the bottom. Most of the rod wrapping thread is on pretty small spools, and these are bigger threads, and they're not actually rod wrapping threads. But I wanted to give people the ability to use these if they wanted to, because some of these do work good. These are machine embroidery threads. All right, so the reason that these holes are larger than they need to be on these plates is because it will allow you some movement. So I have 2 spools that are slightly different sizes here, but the flexibility plus the oversized holes will allow you to bend that somewhat. And it's still going to do its job. It's going to isolate the motion of the spool from the wing nut, and it's going to provide a friction surface for your spool tension. Again, we're going to put, these are all stamped washers, we're going to put the smooth side towards the friction material. If you'll do that, it will make the friction material last pretty much indefinitely because there's nothing cutting into it. It'll provide a smoother movement of the spools. Now we're just going to put the springs back in place, and on this one I turn the smooth side towards the wing nut. That way as you're turning the wing nut, it's a smooth turning motion. It doesn't catch on any of those kind of slightly jagged edges of these stamped washers. And as you can see, that bottom one in order to get the wing nut on, you have to put a little pressure on it to get the wing nut to start. And you have to pull back on the spring just a little bit. It's really not a big deal, but I just want people to be aware of it. If you have a spool that's right around 2 inches long, it's a really tight fit. Again, most rod wrapping threads are not that long. Most of them are on short spools. If you do run into a problem with the spring length being too long, you can actually use this setup without a spring. I do like the spring because I think it gives you a little more control over the spool. But if you need to use it without it, you can control your tension by backing the wing nut off or on. And it will still be pretty smooth for you, just not quite as nice as using the springs. Here's another configuration that you can use. If you're just running one thread spool at a time, you can just install the wing nut and all the hardware associated with one of the other threaded rods first, then put your spool on, install the plate, and tighten the plate up with the wing nut and spring set up on the thread. And it works fine that way. It still isolates the motion of the spool, so there's no problems with it running like this. That plate that isolates the motion of the spool is still going to do its job. It's still going to isolate the motion because it's on the bottom rod, and it's also going to continue to give you your friction material for the tension on the spool. So that's another way that you can set this up. If you're just running one spool at a time, you can do that. You can install multiple spools at a time. And there's still another way that I want to show you. Here I've got two that are very different in size. One's close to 2 inches long and one's just over an inch. So what you might want to do in a situation like this is go ahead and install your spring first. Then a metal washer. Again, the rough side is towards the spring. A friction washer. One of the large diameter washers with the smooth side towards the friction material. Now you can install your thread, and it will work better this way because there's so much difference in the size of those two spools. We're going to go ahead and run both of these spools at the same time, but by reversing the direction of the spring, one's fore and one's aft of the spool. By doing that, you can get a more level end there. Because an inch difference between the two spools, there's a lot of flexibility in the friction plate, but not that much. But if you'll reverse the spring, you can run two spools that are an inch different in size and probably even just a little more than an inch if you needed to. Now you just tighten the wing nut on the top one, and the spring tension will come from the right hand side now instead of the left. It's going to do the same thing, it's just reversed. And you may wonder, why wouldn't you leave the spring towards the inside at all times? Because there's less to take off and on. And that's a valid point. But I'm going to show you why you might not want to do that. As you can see here, I have the springs in different directions. On this side, what I would call the normal configuration. And on this side, it's with the spring to the right of the spools here. So this is done the opposite way. And as you can see, there's a bend there. And the reason why this happens is because I've got more tension on the top spool than the bottom. And the reason for that is because those are metallic threads that have to run off the top of the thread carriage. Or I would recommend it anyway. Because you want metallic threads to go straight from the spool onto the rod. in the event that you should wear out one of these hold down bands, you can just stretch the band and it will slide out from under the holder. It won't come out on its own, but if you stretch it, it makes it small enough that it can squeeze out of the bottom of that holder. These are just regular cloth covered ponytail holders that you can pick up just about anywhere where they sell hair products. Walmart, grocery stores, just about anywhere you can find these things. To reinstall it, you just do the opposite. You stretch it again and slide it back under the holder and into position. All you need to do in order to use these hold down bands is just stretch it across and snap it across the other side. Simple as that. Okay, for normal thread, I like to run the thread off the bottom of the spool. It doesn't matter if the spool's on top or the bottom of the rack. I like to pull the thread from the bottom of the spool. It seems to work better that way running through the guide. Metallic threads are just the opposite. They pull off the top, but I'll show you how to do a metallic wrap in just a minute. First of all, you're going to pull the thread and you're going to put it through the tensioning rod. Once it's in the tensioning rod, then we're going to pull it down to the first guide on the thread carriage. Once it's in place there, we're going to pull it in through the second guide. And now I'm just going to pull some extra line off. That way when the tensioning rod goes back up, I still have lines setting out of the front of that first guide. And now all I'm going to do is just do a simple wrap. I'm not wrapping a guide. I'm just going to do a wrap on a rod. So this is just to show you how to use the jig. You place the rod into the jig, and then you snap your bands across the supports in order to hold the rod in place. Then you just take the thread and lay it over the top of the rod coming from the front. Here it is from the front. You just lay the thread over the top of the rod, and I'm just going to do this a simple way real quick. I'm just going to put a piece of tape on the end of the tag end. So now I've got a spiral started, and I'm just going to start wrapping this rod, and I'm going to cross over my tag end right here. Once you cross over your tag end, you can't take the tape off until you get a few turns on it. Once you get about 5 or so turns, 5 or more, then you can remove the tape and cut your tag end. So I'm just putting those initial turns on this wrap, and once I've got the required amount of turns, I'm just going to remove the tape. Now I'm going to trim that tag end close to that wrap. Now that the tag end is trimmed, I'm just going to continue my wrap. And I'm going to put several turns on this before I do anything else, just to cover that tag end that I cut off there. Now that I've got that covered, I wanted to just kind of show you there's a bit of an angle here. It's about a 5-degree or so angle. If you get too much, then you're going to wrap back over your wrap. You don't want that. And if you get too far ahead of your wrap, then you'll leave a gap. So you want about a 5 or so degree angle there. That pulls the thread tight against the wrap that's already there. Now, if you get out in front, it's going to leave loose wraps. And these are over exaggerated, of course. But I wanted to show you what this tensioning rod allows you to do. With that tensioning rod, it's got a lot of bend in it, so it's going to keep tension on it to where if you need to back up a few turns, that rod will raise up and keep tension on that thread. So you can back up to correct a mistake and then resume your work where you left off. That's a really nice feature to have, and I'm sure experienced people don't necessarily have to have that, but it's never a bad thing to have a tool at your disposal, in my opinion. It's not an experienced or inexperienced thing. If you have the ability to back up a few turns to correct a mistake like I'm doing here, that could mean the difference between having to start a wrap over again or not. So I think it's a good thing to have if you need it. You'll be glad that you do have it, in my opinion. Now I've got several wraps on this. I'm going to go ahead and insert a loop that I've made from another thread. And this loop is going to be where I pull my tag back under the wrap. So once you get your loop in, you're going to want to get at least 5 turns or more to go over that loop before you get ready to pull your tag in back under the wrap. That should be enough turns. So now I'm going to hold tension on the wrap, and I'm going to remove the spring tension rod from the thread, and that loosens everything up now. And I'm just going to pull the thread out of the way and cut it. Now I've got a tag in that's going to go through the loop that I inserted into the wrap. Now I'm pulling tension down on that tag end so the wrap doesn't come undone until I get the loop pulled through to where it's tight. Now it's tight and that tag end can't come loose. I'm going to trim it close to the wrap. And if you trim it close enough, you can pull your loop at about a 45-degree angle and it will completely cover under the wrap. You won't be able to see that tag end at all. You don't have to trim it off or anything like that. If you spend a lot of time trimming your wraps after you've cut off your tag and it's sticking out, you could accidentally nick your wrap and have to start the whole thing over again. I just like to cut it short and pull it completely under, and it just saves you a lot of headaches. So that's just a basic wrap. That's the same thing you do if you're putting on a guide. When you're using metallic threads, of course you can do this however you want to, but in my opinion, the easiest way to do metallic threads and with the least damage to the foil that's wrapped into the thread is to run the metallic threads like these two I have here on the top. If you run those on the top position of the spool holder, then run the thread to where it pulls off the top of the spool. On all the other threads, I like to pull it from the bottom because it's going through the rod that regulates the tension. But when I'm doing it with the metallic threads, I like to pull the threads off the top and wrap it directly onto the rod. Now, this is not quite as easy as it is using regular threads with the tensioning rod and all that. But it's doable, and it actually will produce really good quality results. It's just a little more, you have to think about it a little more as you're doing it. If you need to back up a turn, you don't have this tensioning rod that will allow you to do that. So you actually have to back the rod up with the spool at the same time, pulling line back onto the spool. But I'll show you how to do that. First of all, to get started on a metallic wrap, again, I'm pulling it over the top of the spool. The thread's coming off the top of the spool. I'm just going to lay it over the top of the rod. Once you have your thread over the top of your rod, what I like to do, what I think is the easiest way to do, especially for people that are just beginning, is to go ahead and wrap the thread around the rod a few times and tape it to the rod itself. There's a lot of different techniques you can use to get a thread wrap started, but to me, if you're just starting out, this is the easiest way to do it because the tape does a lot of your work for you. Now I can completely let go of this and everything's fine. I can take my time, work with 2 hands on the rod if I want to. If I need to guide the thread a little, I've got both my hands free with this tape down like this. It's not the quickest way to do it, but it's the easiest in my opinion if you're just starting out. Okay, now we've got our thread wrapped around the rod a few times. I'm just going to do this like I did the other wrap with the normal thread and wrap it around and cross it back over the tag end. Right here now I've just crossed over the tag end, and I'm going to start my wrap that's going over the tag. I'm just going to tighten that up as I go a little there. It'll save you from having to do as much work later. And I'm just going to continue my wrap here and get several turns over the top of the tag end. Once you get it started pretty well, you'll want to go back and just tighten this up against the wrap so that everything looks nice and neat. All right, I'm just going to put me a few more turns on here. Again, you want at least 5 turns over your tag end to get it locked down good. Once you do that, you can pull the tape off. By the way, a lot of times I do more than 5 turns to get it locked down. That would be what I would say is the minimum you'd normally want to do to lock one down. If you pull the tape off too early, the whole wrap will come unraveled pretty easily. Okay, now I'm just going to pull this back towards my thread a little to straighten this tag end up under the wrap a little bit and tighten that up. Now I can trim this tag end off since it's secured underneath the wrap now. I'm just going to trim that off. And I'm just going to continue my wrap like you normally would do. And I'm just going to go back and tighten this up again. You can use a tool to tighten your wraps up. A lot of people do. Or you can use your fingernails if you have a little bit of length on your fingernails. It doesn't take much. Fingernails are nice because they're definitely soft enough they're not going to damage your thread. So if you have a little bit of a fingernail, that's an easy way to tighten your thread wraps up. Okay, I've got several turns on this wrap now. What I like to use to pull my tag end back under the wrap on metallic threads is monofilament, and I've just got a 6-pound mono here. And the reason I like to use this instead of regular thread to pull it back under is that foil can fray normal thread slightly and leave some little fuzzies in your wrap. If you use monofilament, you don't have to worry about that. So I'm just going to take this loop I created out of that 6-pound mono. And the monofilament I'm using is just cheap stuff. It's like $1 for this little spool of it, and it'll last a long time just for making loops. You might not want to fish with it. I don't know. It might be all right. But for what we're doing here, this works just fine, and it's inexpensive, and it's got a nice little spool with a thread keeper on it. So as you cut it, you can pull it through that keeper, and it will stay there. Once you get your loop under your wrap, you're just going to continue wrapping over the top of the loop. And you want to do at least 5 turns. Again, I usually do more because I want to cut my tag end short and pull it back through the wrap without any excess sticking out. That's just the way I prefer to do it. Okay, I've got several wraps over the top of this loop now. What I do want to show you is real quick before I finish this wrap off is if you do make a mistake, it's a little tougher with the metallic thread to back it up, but you can do it. I'm just going to pull this over and make an exaggerated gap here. So you can see now I've got quite a gap here. If you want to back up some because you don't have this tensioning rod anymore using the metallic threads, what you'll have to do is back the spool up as you turn the rod at about the same rate. In fact, you might even want to turn the rod just a little slower so you keep everything tight. And you're just going to back it up like this. And once you've got back to where your mistake started, you can continue on with your wrapping. So that's how you would back one up using this method. At this point, I'm going to go ahead and cut this tag here, and I'm holding pressure on the wrap at the end here with my thumb. That way it doesn't come unraveled once I cut this. So now I'm free from the spool. I have a tag in here. I'm just going to pass this through my monofilament loop. Once I get it in my loop, I'm just going to pull tension back towards the spool to keep this tight. And I'm just going to cinch this down against the wrap. I don't want to pull it through yet. I just want it to where it's got some tension on it so that this can't come unwrapped. Once I've got it pulled tight against my wrap, I can go ahead and trim this tag end off. And there's just barely any sticking out. It's just got just a little bit of thread there where I trim that tag. And I cut them short like that because I want to pull this back towards the direction that I was wrapping in. That will allow it to pull under the wrap without any tag end sticking out that you have to trim off afterwards. The reason I do that is because there's been too many times where I've been wrapping a wrap and I have come back and trimmed that tag in and ended up nicking my wrap and having to start all over because it comes unraveled pretty quick once you cut it. If you do it this way, there's very little tag to start with, and it pulls back at an angle towards the direction that your tension was coming from. At this point, I'm using metallic thread, so I'm pulling off this top. My tension's coming directly from the spool. So I want to pull back at about a 45-degree angle back towards the spool, and that will pull that tag under and keep tension on it the whole time. If I were using normal thread that was coming out of this front guide, I'd want to pull it back this way at a 45-degree angle under the wrap. But since I'm pulling directly off the spool, I'm going to pull it back towards the spool. So I've got my loop. Now I'm ready to pull that tag in under. I'm just going to give it a nice quick tug at about a 45-degree angle back towards that spool. And now my wrap is completed. The tag end is not sticking out. You might want to go back and tighten all this up because sometimes when you pull it through, it loosens just a hair. It gives you a little bit of a gap between your threads. Now I've got all that tightened up. I will put the camera down closer to where you can see how this wrap turned out. All right, there's that completed metallic wrap. I really like metallic thread. For one thing, it doesn't tend to go translucent when you put epoxy over it, so you can still really see the thread in its pretty much its true color. It darkens just a little bit, but it also has a nice look regardless of that fact. It's just a little harder to work with, but I really think using this jig the way I showed you, it makes doing metallic thread wraps pretty easy. I think it's in my opinion, pulling it off the top is the way to go for your metallic threads. And the reason is because if you're passing the threads through these different guides and through the tensioning rod, that foil can get a little messed up. If you're pulling it directly off the spool, the foil doesn't have a chance to get damaged during the wrapping process. But I think that's a nice looking wrap. It's nice and tight. Everything looks good on it. So that was the way that I would recommend that you do your metallic threads, directly off the top spool.